But it's good to be back with you all, as I mentioned earlier. And in one sense, as we left off 6 weeks ago, I'm going to pick right back up to kind of where we were at, going through the Old Testament of many different characters in the Old Testament. And so this morning we'll be looking at the life of Daniel. And Lord willing, next week we'll be looking at Nehemiah. And so Daniel, well, it's during the time of when Babylon came and destroyed Jerusalem. Next week, Nehemiah, we find Nehemiah going back to Jerusalem and rebuilding the walls. And really, in one sense, I'm looking forward to next week. I'm looking forward to this today as well. But Nehemiah is, I would say, almost one of my favorite characters in the Old Testament. There's so much about him. But once again, as we think about Daniel, there is so much that we can learn from his life. Now, in life, in your day-to-day, have you ever come against situations, circumstances, where people want you to do something that goes against your conscience? People expect you to do things that it goes against what you believe. They want you to do things their way that goes against Jesus' way. Now, we live in a culture that is constantly shifting and changing, and it is drastically different than, well, just a couple decades ago. And so many times, we will face situations that will put us in places to where we have to choose, what am I going to do? What ought I do? Now, as we consider Daniel, well, if you're familiar with the life of Daniel, what is the first thought when you hear of Daniel? Daniel and what? The lion's den. Now, we're not going to look at Daniel in the lion's den, which we find in Daniel chapter 6. Well, most historians would say at that point, Daniel was probably maybe in his 90s. And you know, when we make decisions, choosing to do what's right, normally it does not start when we're in the 90s. It starts much earlier. It's not something that we can expect one day I'm going to start making right choices. It has to start today, not someday. And that's what we find with Daniel. Rather than jumping to chapter 6, we're going to start off in the very first chapter of Daniel. And we find when he's probably just a teenager, a young man, taken away from his parents. Nobody's looking after him. Nobody's looking over his shoulder. And yet, even in that moment, he chooses to take a stand. But yet, in the midst of all of this, as we look at his life, I want us to consider us, because we will be put in situations like that. But Daniel, what we find, he was dogmatic in his belief, but yet at the same time, he was diplomatic in his behavior. Now, that is extremely important for us to consider. He was dogmatic in his belief. He was not going to change what he believed, but yet at the same time, he was diplomatic in his behavior. He was diplomatic with the people that was around him. And many times when we are taking a stand and the culture around us presses against us to do something different, well, oftentimes, we will be diplomatic in our belief, or we will be dogmatic in our behavior. We will just anchor down, and I am not going to change. I am going to stay this course. And we become very aggressive and abrasive. Have you ever found that can become natural in our circumstances? Or we can try to be very diplomatic with people, and I don't want to ripple any water. I don't want to ruffle any feathers, so I'm going to change what I believe for other people's sake. But that's not what Daniel did. He was dogmatic in his belief. He was not going to change, yet at the same time, he was diplomatic in his behavior. Daniel chapter 1, in verse 1, it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men, in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, processing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Well, stop right there and we consider what is taking place. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came in and destroyed Jerusalem. Absolutely destroyed the walls, destroyed the temple of Jerusalem. And in one sense, he was trying to, wipe out what was known of Israel. He was trying to adjust the culture of Israel. And in the meantime, he took, many of the young men, royals, children of the nobles, people of importance from Jerusalem. The young men, well-educated, smart young men, good-looking young men. We don't know how many of them there were, but we do know 4 of them. Daniel, most often we know of the other ones as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Those were the names given by Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian names. But as we consider all of this, there was so much pressed on Daniel. He was taken away from his family. He was taken away from his friends. He was taken away from everything that was familiar with him into a foreign land. And, the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, wanted him to learn a new language. Daniel was okay with that. He wanted a new education. Daniel was okay with that. He even gives him a new name. Daniel was okay with that, although Daniel continued to refer to himself as Daniel. And Daniel, the name Daniel, means God is judge. He recognized, God is my judge. Daniel probably had a new wardrobe. Daniel was okay with that. But what we find here is there is one thing Daniel was not okay. And it was the diet that was given to him. Now, when we read through that, we might think, it's just food. Food is food, right? But yet for Daniel, it went so much deeper than just food. Now, some might say, it went against the Levitical law. And there, of course, we're familiar, there were certain laws that forbid, say, pork or horse. Now, we still do not eat horse, but I've heard that some in Babylon did. But I don't know that that was the reason that Daniel would not do it. Because, he didn't drink the wine either. And there was nothing against drinking the wine unless a person had taken a Nazirite vow. We don't find anything about Daniel taking a Nazirite vow. So I don't believe it was as much about the food as it was what the food resembled. Now, as we consider Daniel, as he's put in this position, the food, what it symbolized was this food, the king, he would offer food and wine to the Babylonian gods, the pagan gods. And what was left over and what was taken or offered, they would then feed to the king and to the people. Now, in a sense, what it was doing in their hearts, it was recognizing and saying, our gods are the source of our provision of what we have. These gods are the source of our strength and our ability. And in so one sense, it was David was put in this position. Would he go along with what the Babylonians requested, or not even requested, what the Babylonians demanded? And really, he would be submitting over and saying, I recognize that everything I have comes from these pagan gods. Or would he remain loyal to his true God? And he's put in this situation. Now, if we were put in this situation, what would we do? Now, Daniel's life had been spared. Instead of killing Daniel, they actually wanted to make him a model citizen. Instead of making him a slave, they wanted to train him to serve in the king's palace. Instead of starving him, they wanted to give him the same food that was put in front of the king. It's probably good food. Would you risk everything for the sake of remaining loyal to God? I mean, his parents weren't around to correct him, to tell him off. The priest wasn't around to tell him what he had done was wrong. And in fact, what had God done for him recently? I mean, consider what had just happened. I mean, he was taken from his hometown. His nation had been destroyed. The temple in which they would go to and worship God was absolutely destroyed, and all of the articles that were from there was taken over to Babylon, which worshiped the pagan gods. And God did not stop any of that. His parents weren't around, but that may have been because his parents may have been killed in the battle. And so this would have been a very easy time to become bitter against God. And yet in this time, Daniel remained loyal to God. You know, Daniel was here at a crossroads. And you could even say he could either give the visible King Nebuchadnezzar what he expected, or he could give the invisible king, the Lord God, what he deserved. Think about that for a moment. We're put in circumstances, we're put in situations, people around us, people are constantly expecting things of us, aren't they? They're wanting us to do certain things. And we are often put in the situation, do we give the visible what they expect, or do we give the invisible what he deserves? Now, with all of this, he could violate his conscience and hope that God would understand. Or he could violate the king's expectations and hope the Babylonians understand. Which one do you think would be more understanding? When we are put in situations, have you ever made a decision with the thought, you know, I don't want to ripple any feathers, and I know God will forgive me afterwards? It's easy to do that because when we look at the two options, well, we know that God on the one side is very loving, patient, merciful, and forgiving. And on the other hand, well, he already knew what Nebuchadnezzar would like. Very arrogant, very demanding, merciless, and violent. Which one would you rather upset? And you know, so often we will rather go the easy route rather than taking a stand for what is right. We will rather go the route of the least resistance rather than taking a stand, choosing to do what is right. Integrity. What is integrity? It's choosing to do what is right no matter the cost. As one preacher put it, doing what you ought to even if it costs you. Makes it a little easier with that rhyme. Doing what you ought to even if it costs you. And for Daniel, he was going to do what he ought to even if it cost him. Now, for us, we're not going to meet Nebuchadnezzar. But yet at the same time, we're constantly put in situations where it may go against our conscience. And we are constantly put at crossroads. And we have to choose, which route do I go? And as we considered thinking about Daniel later on, Daniel facing the lion's den, and you could even look at, that's in chapter 6, I believe it's chapter 5, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are placed before the king. No, actually, chapter 4, I believe. And they were cast into the fiery furnace. Each one of them, they were put in a situation, will you bow down, or will you choose to do what's right and take a stand? But it did not start later on in life. It started earlier on. And when we choose to do what's right, the next time it'll be easier to choose to do what's right. If we choose to go with the flow, the next time it'll be easier to choose to go with the flow. Another way, as Jesus put it in Luke chapter 16 and verse 10, he said, he who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. And he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Sometimes we might say, well, this is just a little thing. It doesn't really matter. But when it's the big things in life, then I will make the right decision. But the truth is, if we're not faithful in the little things, we're not going to be faithful in the big things. And if we cannot choose to do what is right when the stakes are low, we will not be able to choose to do what is right when the stakes are high. How did Daniel respond? In verse 8 it says, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. As it mentions, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. What does that mean? Before he was ever put in the situation, he already had his mind made up what he was going to do. If we wait until we're put in the situation, we're going to try to rationalize everything in our mind. But before Daniel ever left Jerusalem, as a young man, he was determined, I am going to stay true and loyal to my Lord. Before he ever was brought in before the chief of the eunuchs. He had already made up his mind, I am going to stay true and faithful and loyal to my Lord. And when he was put the request or the demand in front of him, saying, you need to eat the king's meat and drink the king's wine, well, for him it wasn't a matter of choice. He had already made up his mind. He was already willing to take a stand no matter the cost. But this is where he was dogmatic in his belief, but diplomatic in his behavior. Notice there what Daniel did. He purposed in his heart, he would not defile himself. Therefore, he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now, what was the first thing that Daniel did? Now, we know that he met up with his friends and they talked about it because they all came to the same conclusion that they were going to do this. But he went directly to the person in charge. And he hit the issue head on. He did not try to beat around the bush. He did not try to make up some stories. Well, if I eat this meat, it's going to cause a large rash, and so I can't eat the meat. Sometimes we make things up because we don't want to be direct and show we are taking a stand, and we try to make excuses in order for somebody to accept, rather than stating what we believe and why we believe it. He didn't try to manipulate his way, but he simply requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he would not defile himself. Now, how did it go? Well, in verse 9 it says, now God had brought Daniel into favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your face as looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. Now the response, the chief of the eunuchs, he respected Daniel. And we can see from later on Daniel's demeanor in his respect towards those that were in position, I believe, had a great deal in God bringing him into favor. Because we see the humility later on. We see his spirit and his respect towards the chief of the eunuchs. But the chief of the eunuchs responds, you're putting me in a difficult situation. The king has given me this command. I'm passing it down to you. I'm the middleman. If I change things against the king, it may not be you that gets put to death. It may be me that gets put to death. And all of a sudden, well, now what's Daniel going to do? It's not just Daniel's life at stake. He could be putting somebody else's life at stake. And once again, it's another opportunity to rationalize. Well, I wouldn't want anybody else to be hurt, so I'll just go along with the flow. And these are opportunities that we try to rationalize in our mind, trying to make it easy as possible, the least resistance, rather than taking a stand. But notice what Daniel does. Verse 11, it says, so Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies, and as you see fit, so deal with your servants. The first thing that we see here is his humble request for a trial period. Okay, I'm not going to ask for you to do it for 3 years. Could you give us 10 days? We don't see the king until 3 years from now. Could you just give us 10 days? And then at the end of that 10 days, notice his response. You can do as you see fit. Now, there's many people that we will come in contact with that will try to pressure us to do something different. It could be in the home. It could be our family members. It could be friends. It could be the boss telling us or wanting us to do certain things that we know shouldn't be the best thing for us to do. How do we speak with them? For Daniel, you could say he's negotiating with him. But yet at the same time, he was not willing to compromise. One thing Daniel did not do was give an ultimatum. Sometimes we give ultimatums. If you don't give this to me, then I won't fill in the blank. If you don't allow me to do this, then this is what I will do. But what does that do when you give somebody an ultimatum? It puts them on the defense, right? But what Daniel did, he allowed the person who was in charge to remain in charge the whole time. Daniel never tried to lift himself and put himself in a place where he had the power and he had the authority. Instead, the entire time, he recognized the person who was over him and allowed him to be over him. And that is why he humbly requested, could you give us 10 days? And at the end of that 10 days, Daniel doesn't say, I'm still not going to eat the king's meat. But Daniel did say, you can decide whatever you want to do. You can punish me, you can force me, you are still in charge. But he says, you can see, examine us. But one thing that we do see in these conversations, it wasn't really all about the food anyways, to begin with. At first, it sounded like this was a demand about the food. But in the end, we see it really didn't matter about the food. It all mattered about his appearance and his performance. The king, to be honest, didn't care what he ate. The king cared about how he looked and how he performed at the end of that 3 years. And sometimes when we try to justify our actions, we try to play out the future. If I choose this, this is what's going to happen. If I choose to do what is right, these are all the consequences that I will have. But if I go ahead and choose what I know isn't quite right, but it's what is expected around me and it's the easiest path, this will be how the future will play out. Have you ever played out the future in your mind? Yeah, we do. And sometimes what we think is the big issue may not actually be the big issue. And in this situation, the big issue was not about the food. It was about the appearance. And Daniel says, when the time comes, at the end of the 10 days, you can examine us, see how we look. You decide at that point. Verse 14, so he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of that 10 days, chief of the eunuch says, you know what? After you've gone through this trial period, you do look better. So I'm going to allow you to keep eating the vegetables and drink the water and have a different diet from the rest. And it mentions there, God gave them knowledge and skill. God blessed them. And sometimes when we make a decision, we look at it as what's the worst outcome and who can spare me from the worst outcome, rather than what will be the greatest blessing and who can give the greatest blessing. Rather than looking at the invisible king, or looking at the visible king and saying, he's the violent one, he can give me judgment, it may be looking at the invisible, and he's the loving one who can bring the blessings. It's not just looking out which route is the easiest, but which one in the long run will be the best. In verse 18, it goes on. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus. In the end, it says that Daniel and his friends were found 10 times better than everyone else. And God had blessed them and given them a greater degree. But you know, so many times we don't look at the long run. We just look at the here and now. The current is flowing. And sometimes, have you ever stood in a stream, kind of the sandy bottom, and as the current is flowing, you feel the sand is actually being pushed out from underneath your feet. And sometimes it feels like that. And yet, even in the midst of that, well, when we consider the phrase or the thought of integrity, doing what we ought to, even if it costs you. And in the end, integrity is respected far more than just going with the flow. Now, as we consider Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33, it says, "But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble." In one sense, Daniel, he first sought the kingdom of God. He didn't try to please other people and try to go with the expectations of others. He took a stand. He kept his eyes on the things of God, the kingdom of God, and he allowed everything else to fall in its place. For Daniel, the outcome was brilliant. Now, for us, sometimes when we make the right choice, well, a relationship still might be broken. A job still might be lost. And that doesn't mean that we should have changed our choice, but we can still trust and rest in God's promises, knowing that it's not just the outcome today, but my decisions today will impact my decisions tomorrow and 10 years from now. We can't expect to make the right decision 10 years from now in the big events unless we're willing to make the right decision today in the day-to-day events.